NATO tanks have one common problem which may have actually contributed to the failure of Ukraine's summer counter-offensive.
Just inside a tank on our way into Gaza. There is rubble and destruction as far as you can see.
They're digging in their positions, they're practicing. Pinpoint accuracy over target is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is Dr. Jack Watling, land warfare expert from the Royal United Services Institute here in London. Jack, you've written that tanks aren't dead, but they are too heavy.
Yes, certainly NATO tanks. So NATO tanks were developed in terms of the modern fielded fleets for defending West Germany in the 1980s. And therefore they knew the terrain they were going to be fighting over, and they weren't expected to maneuver very much. They needed to survive for as long as possible in place to knock out as many Soviet tanks as possible. And what that led to was tanks which are fantastically accurate, very survivable, and extremely heavy. Now, to give you an example of the consequence of that, most bridges in Eastern Europe will not support vehicles that are over 60 tons within the weight distribution that a tank
And let's be
covers.
clear, the German Leopard 2, the American Abrams, the British Challenger 2 are all significantly over 60 tons.
Over that, yeah. So the Leopard is about 69, Challenger's 72, etc.
Compared to the Soviet tanks, which are
Much lighter in the 40s and 50s. And so that's problem one. The second problem is that in order to keep a tank alive today, you need some additional things. You need electronic warfare protection, you need active protection that will intercept anti-tank guided weapons, and those things come at significant weight. An APS, an active protection system, needs radar, it needs cooling, it weighs about 3 tons. And so when you start not only adding that on the vehicle, but adding it on top of the vehicle, so it's becoming more top heavy, you end up with a vehicle which will sink into the ground, quite literally, unless it is on the ideal type of terrain. And so in terms of the consequences of the counteroffensive last year, it meant that the Russians could look at a map, they could look at the weight of the vehicles, they could look at which routes would actually allow the passage of those vehicles, and then optimize their defense against those routes, because it was obvious that an attack with those vehicles would have to go down those routes.
So they knew where the Ukrainians were coming.
I mean, they knew where the Ukrainians were coming for other reasons too, right? So we shouldn't say this is monocausal. They understood the plans. But yes, this absolutely contributed. And it means that when US officers talk about maneuver and how you can achieve surprise by outflanking, and actually there's a lot less maneuver space in that environment than people often imagine, because their vehicles simply will not work on the ground that you might want to exploit.
So I spent time with the Challenger squadron in Ukraine, and they told me exactly this, that in fact the commander said he'd driven a T-72 and he'd driven a Challenger, and he said the Challenger kept on getting stuck.
Good tank gets stuck.
Good tank gets stuck, exactly. Accurate, well defended, but really couldn't move it around. And in fact, the day we were with them, we got stuck in the mud on a training range, so we saw it in real life.
And it's worth noting that that is what will get the Challenger destroyed, because as soon as it is in a known position and not moving from that position, that's when you'll get a whole series of drones coming over and knocking away at it, and they will destroy it.
We've seen that, indeed.
That's what happened, yeah.
Is there a sweet spot? Is there a correct weight that a tank should be?
So the answer is as light as possible from a mobility point of view. Obviously, you also want the crew to be able to survive hits against most weapon systems. And what you tend to find is that something which will knock out a tank at 55 tons will still knock out the tank even if it has enough armor at 80 tons. It won't necessarily completely destroy the tank, but it will still probably blow off its sensors, immobilize it, etc. So you start getting declining returns on the level of protection. At the same time, if you go below about 45 tons, then you start to make some really significant compromises in protection, where an awful lot of things will simply destroy the vehicle. So the question then is how many sensors and how much firepower do you want in the vehicle above that kind of 44, 45 ton range? And that brings you to about 54, 55 tons as the tipping point where you have an optimal balance.
And yet, I mean, you work very closely, I know, with the British and the American militaries. All of their tanks are significantly, all the NATO tanks, I mean, main NATO tanks, the Abrams, the Challenger, the Leopard, the French Leclerc, slightly lighter, but still.
Slightly lighter.
I mean, even the new vehicles that the British Army is bringing into service, are very heavy. The Ajax, I mean, it's not as heavy as 50 tons.
No, it's 44.
How is this message being received by those armed forces that you work with? It sounds almost like heresy, what you're saying to the tankies.
I was having a conversation with a senior US tank officer who is very, very in the weeds, should we say, on the future of armoured vehicle design. And he was vehemently disagreeing with me about this 54-ton point. And I said, well, what is the optimal ton? He said 58, less than 60. I was like, okay, I'll concede the point. You can have your 4 tons extra weight. But broadly speaking, among technical experts, this is not in dispute. The Israelis have a slightly different view because they are using their tanks, again, for a very limited role where they can optimize them. But the point really isn't in dispute. The issue is we have very large fleets of these tanks. We have production lines in process. We have all the training facilities, etc. And so while this might be relevant for designing the next generation of tanks, that doesn't mean that it's worth scrapping the ones that we've already invested in.
The Challenger 3, for example, the one that Britain is now upgrading its fleet to, is going to be as heavy, if not heavier, than the Challenger 2.
It will be heavier than the Challenger 2, and that is going to be a very serious problem.
And what does this mean for Ukraine? What does it mean for Ukraine now? I mean, they've got, they put in a lot of political capital in requesting tanks from NATO allies. Britain, obviously, the first, sending 14 Challenger 2s. That appeared to sort of open the gates for the Leopards and the Abrams to follow. They've also got the Bradleys, the infantry fighting vehicles. They've got these vehicles. They've also got their sort of legacy fleet of Soviet era and Soviet design tanks, the T-72s, the T-80s. What does this mean for them now as they look at trying still to roll back the Russian invasion?
So the challenge the Ukrainians have is that they are in a full-scale war and mass matters. So, for example, a NATO tank battalion usually has 44 to 56 tanks in it, right? By the beginning of the offensive last year, the Ukrainians had received 55 Leopards from all of their partners. So just over 1 doctrinal battalion's worth. For an offensive brigade, armoured brigade, you would want to have 2 battalions of main battle tanks. And so the lead brigade that was supposed to do the initial break-in, the 47th, which received Leopards, was under strength against what we would consider the doctrinal minimum to perform that task. And yet that one brigade essentially consumed the vast majority of Leopards that had been donated, right? And so you go back through the brigades that were supposed to complete their tasks, and beyond the 1st and the 33rd and the 47th, you start seeing that they were manifestly under-equipped. The 82nd had Challengers, as you say, they had 14, they had 1 company's worth, right? A brigade should have a battalion at least, as a mechanized brigade. And so the Ukrainians were asking for anything they could get hold of to even meet what we would consider the minimum threshold to be able to conduct the operation that they were endeavouring to execute.
But they
and they didn't get there.
But they have also received, and they did have large numbers of T-72s. They've captured some, they've been donated many. I mean, am I right in understanding, are those tanks, the Soviet-era tanks, better than the NATO tanks, it's particularly for what Ukraine is trying to achieve now, because they're lighter?
Well, they offer more options in terms of their mobility, and the T-80 in particular because of its engine. But they are far worse in their protection. And that's not just a weight thing. You could achieve much greater protection for weight on those tanks. It's just that they are very, very old designs, right? They are updated designs from the initial T-72 design, and there's a limit to how much you can protect them. And so those tanks are very vulnerable on the battlefield to a range of systems. But from the Ukrainian point of view, in terms of their utility at an operational scale, they are roughly comparable. So, it's not, the Ukrainians were not saying we need Leopards to win the war. They were saying we have a requirement for a certain volume of equipment to achieve the operation, and we didn't get there.
Jack, thank you very much for joining me on World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey. If you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions for me or for Jack, please ask them in the comments below and we will try to answer them next time.